Well, good morning, Woodhaven. It's so good to be back with you today as we continue our journey through 1 Samuel. And last week, we stepped into one of the most well-known moments in all of Scripture, the battle between David and Goliath. But we kind of looked at it through a different lens. We challenged the idea that David was the underdog in the story, and instead considered that he might have been the favorite. He didn't step into the battle blindly or in fear. He walked into the battle with confidence, not in just himself, but in who his God was. And because of that, we're reminded that we too can step into the valleys. We can face the giants in our lives and trust that God is always fighting for us. But here's the thing. David's victory over Goliath wasn't the end of his story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. So the question becomes, what happens next? How does David navigate this new journey that lies ahead when the spotlight is on him, when pressure mounts, when life gets difficult or complicated? Will he continue to follow in the heart of God, or will he fall into the patterns of the world? And so I want to jump into the rest of David's story and look at how it unfolds. And so 1 Samuel 18, 6 through 8 tells us that after David's victory over Goliath, the people of Israel were celebrating. It says, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, with timbrels and lyres. And as they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, Saul was not exactly thrilled with this new hit single on Israel's Billboard Top 100. In fact, he was absolutely furious about it. It says Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, but me with only thousands? You see, David's victory over one giant was immediately followed by the rise of another giant, jealousy. And just a few verses later, Saul's jealousy begins to kind of boil over. And during a dinner at Saul's home, all those around the table are kind of praising David. And Saul is consumed by rage. And so he grabs not one, but two spears, and he hurls them at David. And David kind of has to hit like the poop deck. He has to dodge the spears. And luckily he survives, and Saul misses. And I don't know about you, but I've been at some awkward dinner parties before, but the moment like spears are being hurled, I think you've hit a new awkward level of tension. Now, occasionally I have to like dodge a fork when my daughter Charlie throws it at me when she doesn't like the Brussels sprouts that are in front of her. But like this is a very, very awkward moment. It's a low point for Saul and a terrifying moment for David. But David chooses to stay. He chooses to continue to serve Saul and fight Israel's battles. Now, luckily, Saul stops throwing spears, but he does get more creative in his attempts to try and eliminate David. And he starts sending David into all these like needless battles. And he's hoping that David will eventually be killed in one of these battles. But the problem is David keeps winning. And with every victory, David's popularity continues to grow, and Saul gets more and more frustrated. And eventually, Saul reaches a breaking point. And at a meeting with all of his commanders and advisors, he tells them that we must kill the son of Jesse. You see, Saul won't even refer to David by his name. He refers to him as the son of Jesse as a way to insult David, as a way to say, you're not the future king of Israel. You are just a son of Jesse. He strips him of his identity. But there's a problem. You see, one of those advisors is Jonathan, who is Saul's son, but also David's best friend. And Jonathan pleads with his father to spare David's life, but Saul refuses to listen. And I want you to hear with me this argument that they have from 1 Samuel 20, 30 through 33. It says, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse? Again, Saul will not refer to David by name. To your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you. As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor the kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. You see, Saul, in yet another fit of rage, here he goes throwing spears again. And last week we learned how David was very accurate with a sling. Luckily, Saul is not very accurate when he tries to throw spears. And he misses Jonathan, but Jonathan realizes in this moment, like, Saul is out to get David. And so he goes and tells David, you have to go. You have to go on the run. My father and all of his men are coming to kill you. And just like that, David goes from a celebrated warrior to a fugitive. And for the next 13 years of his life, he's on the run. He's hiding in caves. He's navigating betrayals. He's wrestling with fear. And he's learning what it means to truly trust God, even in the most difficult circumstances. You see, in this season, David faces some of the biggest challenges of his life. He has victories that help shape him for the future and failures that test his heart. Time and time again, David finds himself in that familiar place of tension that we see come up repeatedly in 1 Samuel. Will he follow the ways of the world, or will he remain faithful to God's heart? And we all go through these seasons, times when we feel lost, uncertain, or on the run from something. And these are the moments that often shape us, the moments that test our character. Will we grow, or will we give up? And here's the truth. We can't walk through these moments alone. The people that we surround ourselves with matter deeply. They can either pull us away from who God is calling us to be, or they can help us step into the person we were created to become. If you look at Saul, his advisors continued to let him spiral deeper and deeper into darkness. No one challenged him, no one stopped him, and he became consumed by his jealousy and his insecurities. But David's story looks a little different. God places the right people in David's life at the right time. People who walk with him, who challenge him, and call him back to who he truly is. David is far from perfect. In fact, as his story continues to unfold, we'll see just how flawed he truly is. But every time he stumbles, there are voices in his life reminding him of his identity, pointing him back to God's heart, and helping him grow through his failures. Friends, we are all going to make mistakes in our lives, but our mistakes don't get to define us. God's grace does. And if our hearts are truly set on him, we can learn from our failures, be shaped by his love, and take daily steps to reflect Christ in all we do. You see, a heart after God's own heart is not a perfect heart. It's a teachable one. It's the willingness to learn. It's not about never failing. It's being willing to get back up and try to become more like Jesus in all that we do. Now, we could spend the rest of the morning blitzing through all of the stories from the last 13 years of David's life. But this morning, I want to just focus on one. You see, while the story of David and Goliath is one of the most well-known stories in all of Scripture, today I want to introduce you to someone whose story isn't as famous. And so over the past few days, even this morning, I've been asking people, have you heard of the story of Abigail? And honestly, I was very relieved when almost everybody said no. If everyone had immediately said, yeah, I know her, I know everything about her, it would have completely ruined my illustration. I've been like, I'm doing something wrong this morning. But Abigail might not be a household name, but in my opinion, she's a very influential character in the Bible. She operates behind the scenes, but the way that God uses her is profound. As a father of a daughter or a girl dad, I believe that representation matters. I want my daughter to grow up hearing powerful stories of how God elevated women's voices. Because in the first century, society often tried to silence women. Yet some of the most powerful, most impactful, and life-changing figures in the Bible are women. And so I want to ensure that their voices aren't lost behind the scenes, but are boldly proclaimed. Because, friends, sharing our voice is hard. We've all likely witnessed something we knew was wrong, but at the moment, we were too afraid to speak up. Maybe we were worried about the consequences for ourselves, concerned what others might think. Or maybe we didn't know what to say in the moment. See, Abigail's story is a powerful example of standing in the gap, of speaking up when it matters most. It's about having the courage to use your voice to encourage others to reconsider their choices and to remind them of their identity as beloved children of God. And so Abigail's story unfolds while David is on the run. But before we dive in, I want to revisit David's journey. So up to this point, David has been on the run for about 7 years. And over this time, he's kind of gathered his own following. And the people of Israel are pretty eager for him to be their next king. And one day, while David is on the run, he finds Saul asleep in a cave with absolutely no protection. And so David gets the opportunity to kill Saul, to end his time on the run. But David's an honorable man, a man after God's own heart, and so he actually spares Saul's life. And I want you to listen to what Saul says to David after this encounter in the cave. 1 Samuel 24 says, "David, you are more righteous than I," Saul said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. Why, when a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed?" In essence, Saul is saying, I've shown you nothing but evil, David, and yet you repay me with grace? Why? But friends, isn't that the message of the entire gospel? That despite what we deserve, Jesus showed us grace. One of the most Christ-like things we can do is not give people what they deserve, but to shower them with the grace and love of God. And for a moment, David's grace actually shuts down Saul's evil plan. And it led to a little bit of a truce for a while. Now, unfortunately, Saul's pride does catch back up with him, and the truce does not last very long. But for the purpose of the story we're exploring today, they are at a ceasefire. And one evening during this truce, David and his followers were traveling, and they encountered a group of shepherds. And these men worked for a man named Nabal, who we'll get into in a little bit. And Nabal's shepherds were transporting wool and goods to be sold at the market. And during this time, trade routes were very, very dangerous. There was no police force to kind of protect travelers. People from different areas did not get along. And so the trade routes were very treacherous. They were filled with violence, theft, and often murder. And so as Nabal's shepherds approached David's camp, they were likely filled with fear. They probably thought to themselves, what if this group was a band of robbers? What if we are going to lose all of our master's goods? Or worse, our lives? And when David sees these shepherds, he's filled with empathy. He remembers his own time as a young shepherd, and he could relate to their fears and anxieties. So he instructs his men to kind of form a protective circle around the shepherds, offering them safety and helping them get to the market. No goods were stolen, no lives were lost, and the shepherds were actually able to maximize their profit for their master Nabal because of David's protection. So this is the setting for Abigail's story. And if you'll open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel 25, verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all of Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the wilderness of Paran. Now, quick pause. Whenever you come across the word wilderness, when you're studying your Bible or reading it, it's a good idea to slow down and pay attention. Biblical writers often use that term to signal something that is significant is going to happen. Some of the most life-changing and pivotal moments in the scriptures actually happen in the wilderness. And so in this case, David is traveling with his men after the death of Samuel. They made their way to Samuel's hometown in Ramah for the burial, which is already a long and exhausting journey. And now they are crossing through the wilderness of Paran, which is a very barren and desolate place. Kind of think like you're driving through Iowa and you know you have to go to the bathroom, but you're like, man, it's going to be a long time before I finally find the next exit. There is absolutely nothing there. And so David's men are hungry, they're tired, they're exhausted. And finally they come across the homestead of Nabal. And so this is where the story kind of takes a turn. David recognizes this farm that they're about to pass as Nabal's household, which is the same group that he protected on the trade routes. But before we get to their interactions, let's take a moment to meet the two key figures in this story, Nabal and Abigail. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was evil and harsh in his dealings. He was a Calebite. You see, Nabal is described as evil and harsh. His name in Hebrew literally actually means fool, not a very flattering description. Yet despite his foolishness, he is very, very wealthy. In contrast, his wife Abigail is introduced with two adjectives, intelligent and beautiful. Now you might be wondering, how did these two end up together? It does not seem like a very fair pairing for Abigail. But what's even more surprising is how Abigail is described. In ancient times, women in the scripture were rarely given personal descriptions. Most were only identified by their relationships, whose wife or mother they were. Most of the time, they're not even named or described at all. But here, the writer makes a bold statement by calling Abigail intelligent, because this was shocking in that culture. Girls did not have much access to education because they were often forced to leave school earlier than the boys to either be married or take care of the home. In fact, only two other women in the Bible are actually described as intelligent. Lady Sophia, who's a personification of the Holy Spirit in Proverbs, and Deborah in Judges. And so this stark contrast between a woman who is known for her wisdom and a husband whose name literally means fool sets the stage for a pretty explosive story. And in this story, God will reveal what intelligence in his kingdom looks like through Abigail's actions, while Nabal's choices will serve as the very definition of foolishness. So now that we know the key players, let's see what happens next. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men. Since we come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to the men coming from who knows where?'" You see, when David and his men arrive at Nabal's farm, they realize it's the same flock they helped. And so David kind of expects some form of gratitude. He sends his men to Nabal for provisions, but Nabal, living up to his name, which literally means fool, flat out refuses. He even sneers, "Who is this son of Jesse?" Now that might seem like an innocent question, but it's actually a loaded insult. Because if you'll remember Saul's conversation with Jonathan, Saul intentionally used that phrase to belittle David, stripping him of his identity and reminding him of his lower status, that he's not the future king of Israel, just a son of Jesse. And so Nabal, by using these same words, is not only insulting David, but also showing that he sides with King Saul. You see, Nabal is much more interested in following a king who lives by the ways of the world and approves of his foolish lifestyle than following a new king who wants everybody to change and follow the heart of God. You see, Nabal's a man who has everything. And the scriptures actually tell us that this is a time of shearing or a time of abundance. He's likely going to have to throw away some stuff because he can't preserve things back then. So it's a time where it makes a lot of sense to give things away. Yet he refuses to show even basic hospitality. And in their culture, turning away a guest was one of the most shameful acts imaginable. You simply just didn't do it. In fact, you would often treat guests much better than your own family because you knew that one day you might be the one traveling and you might need help. So Nabal's response is absolutely shocking, but again, shows how much of a fool he is. Yes, he's wealthy, but in God's eyes, wealth doesn't always equate to wisdom. In fact, God is making it really clear that you can have everything this world values, wealth, power, success, but still be an absolute fool in God's kingdom. Again, that tension of 1 Samuel, the ways of the world versus the ways of God. Nabal's doing really, really well based on the ways of the world, but he's failing when it comes to following the heart of God. And Nabal's actions serve as a stark reminder of the true definition of foolishness, greed, harshness, a refusal to welcome others and offer help and safety to the outsider. And so let's see what happens when Nabal's refusal reaches David. David's men turned around and went back. And when they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped his on as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. You see, when David hears the insult of being called the son of Jesse, his ego and his flaws take center stage. He's furious. He's like, I'm David. Everybody's supposed to love me. I'm going to be king. I protected his men. He owes me. And in this moment, David starts to lose sight of who he truly is. He's blinded by anger, and he turns to his men and commands them, grab your swords. Let's go. We're going to go slaughter everyone. David, the man after God's own heart, has completely lost his way. And consumed by rage, his judgment is clouded, and his response is about to bring devastating consequences. And it's not just for Nabal's household, but potentially for his own future. If he goes and slaughters a bunch of innocent people in a fit of vengeance, what kind of king will he become? How will Israel see him? Can he truly lead God's people down a different path after God's own heart if he chooses to follow the ways of the world when faced with adversity? If he can't model it in his own life, how can he expect other people to follow it? And in this moment, David's pride, ego, and his thirst for revenge have stripped him of his identity and calling. And he's on the verge of becoming the very kind of leader he was expected and anointed to replace. And I think many of us can relate to David in this moment, right? When we're wronged, when our pride is hurt, we often want to get even. But rarely, if ever, does responding out of anger or pride lead to a positive outcome. Sometimes the best thing we can do when we're wronged is actually hit pause rather than react emotionally in the heat of the moment. You see, revenge is a very, very dangerous cycle. It builds and builds upon itself until it finally breaks. If you've had siblings, you know how this goes, right? They wrong you, and then you immediately start plotting your revenge. And then after you've made your revenge, they get you back, and then you get them back worse, and it just keeps on going and going until it finally escalates and someone has to intervene, and both of you are in trouble. And there's nothing good that came out of it. Revenge rarely has a satisfying ending, and David's about to fall into that exact cycle. Right? Earlier, we read how David responded to Saul's evil in the cave with grace. But now he's on the verge of responding to Nabal's evil with his own evil. And if he follows through, not only will his story be altered, but countless other lives could be as well. Because very rarely do our decisions only affect ourselves. Now, fortunately, something is happening back at Nabal's household that might just shift the course of David's actions. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings. But he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us, the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. You see, a young servant overhears everything and he rushes to Abigail, urgently sharing what has happened. And this boy can't be overlooked. He's defying authority. He's going behind his master's back. He's taking a huge risk. Speaking to the boss's wife in the middle of the night in secret would have likely cost him his life. But he knows what's at stake. The fate of their entire household hangs in the balance, and he refuses to stay silent. He lays it all out for Abigail, how David and his men protected them in the wilderness, how Nabal repaid their kindness with insults, and how disaster is now looming. But Abigail, with her intelligence, doesn't hesitate. She sees the danger ahead, and she immediately takes action. Now, I don't know about you, but taking immediate action is not something that's easy for me. I actually had my wife Chelsea's engagement ring for 2 years before I finally proposed. And after we had been married for a few months, she had told me how she had found it in 2 different hiding spots while she waited. Now, thankfully, my wife is a very, very patient woman, and she's proven that true time and time again over the last 10 years. But I am not like Abigail. I don't fly into action. But she doesn't hesitate. She wasn't paralyzed by fear or worried about what might happen. She recognized this was her moment. God was calling her to step in. And yes, she could be put to death for standing up to her husband, but she knew she had to do something. And I'm sure she was afraid, but as we talked about last week, true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's declaring God's presence in the middle of it. It's choosing to move forward through our fear, trusting that God will be with us every step of the way. And so let's look at what she does next, and we're going to jump around a little bit. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men, and she met them. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David, with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention to my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent." She gathers an absolutely incredible amount of supplies, and it's clear that she could not have done that alone. She inspired others to join her. She demonstrated remarkable leadership and quickly mobilized a team to help save her people. There was no hesitation in her actions, and she jumped on a donkey and went to meet David. Now, it's actually important that she chose a donkey instead of a horse, because a horse was a symbol of power and war. But a donkey in that culture represented humility and peace. Abigail intentionally chose this animal to signal her intentions to David. She wasn't coming to fight, but to offer reconciliation. This moment kind of connects to Jesus' own journey. Just as Abigail rode a donkey in humility, Jesus did the same as he entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, demonstrating that his mission was not to conquer by force or military power, but to save everyone through sacrificial love. Abigail's choice, like Jesus, reflects the heart of God, not the world's way of power and dominance or force, but a way of humility, peace, and sacrificial love. And you see, what I find fascinating here about Abigail's story is she catches David off guard. He's one of the most renowned military minds of his time, and yet she is able to surprise him and get the first jump. However, she doesn't confront evil with more evil or violence with more violence. She confronts David with humility, grace, and peace. And when she finally meets David, he's caught up in his own rage, kind of muttering to himself how he's done good for Nabal, only to be repaid with evil. Surely nobody will be alive in the morning. And he's so consumed with anger that he cannot even recognize as an entire caravan surrounds him. But when Abigail approaches, she dismounts from her donkey. She humbles herself before him, laying herself down as a servant. You see, Abigail's humility in this moment is rooted in her deep confidence in who God says she is. Because, friends, true humility isn't about diminishing ourselves. It's about being so secure in our identity in God that we can lay down our pride and elevate others and remind them who they are. Abigail doesn't make herself small in this moment. Rather, she makes space for David to be reminded of who he truly is. And she gives David all the food and supplies she brought, and she asks for the forgiveness of others. She actually takes responsibility for the wrongs committed by Nabal and says, "Punish me, but please spare my people." It's another powerful image of Jesus who took the sins of the world upon himself so that we could be set free and not receive the punishment that we deserve. And after humbling herself before David, Abigail launches into this very powerful speech. And if you ever find yourself in an argument or conflict, I encourage you to pay attention. It might help you next time. 1 Samuel 26 through 29. "And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord, your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as a stone is slung from a sling." You see, Abigail knew that her words and actions were really important, so she carefully chose each one. She immediately lays down at David's feet, calling him my Lord, my Lord, my Lord, and repeating it constantly. It's an intentional choice that contrasts sharply with that dismissal and that insult, son of Jesse. Because in that moment, Abigail isn't just addressing David as David, but she is speaking his future kingship into existence. By calling him my Lord, she affirms that she recognizes him as God's appointed king. She's not only reminding David of his identity, but is also calling him to remember the promises God has made for his future and the new path that he's called to lead Israel on. You see, so often when we try to confront someone, we try to tell them what they are doing is wrong. And that's not necessarily bad, but what happens is they sometimes dig their heels in. People try to justify or defend their actions. Abigail reminds us that we need to lift people up and remind them who they are when they're struggling, not talk down to them and tell them exactly what to do like we have all the answers. You see, Abigail invites David to decide for himself, to remember who he is, to do things a better way, a godly way. And in that culture, David would have had every right to kill Nabal. That was the norm. You responded to evil with your own evil. But as the pure king and one after the heart of God, he was called to be different, to do things the way of the Lord, and to be set apart and show the character of God. And she brings up this incredible line, "But the lives of your enemies will be hurled aside as a stone is slung from a sling." She knows the story of David and Goliath. And she brings David back to when he was a young shepherd boy, when he wanted to do everything to make God's name known and show God's heart. She brings when everyone was focused on how big Goliath was, David showed everyone their God was bigger and would always be victorious. She brings him back to when he was a shepherd, how he cared for the shepherds in Nabal's field out of the goodness of his heart, not for a reward. He's telling David, do not let someone else's actions inform or define your future. Remember who you are. There's a better way. And then she launches into what I believe is her most powerful statement. "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he has promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant." She is in essence saying, David, after God has done everything he has promised, what story do you want them to tell, David? Do you want them to tell the king who has bloodshed on his conscience that did it just like every other king? Or do you want them to tell the story of a man of God who responded in a better way? What story, David, when all of this is just a memory, do you want people to tell about you? And I think that's an important question for all of us. What story do we want people to tell about our lives when all of this is just a memory? My parents used to tell me growing up, if you accomplish nothing else today, make sure that someone experiences the kindness of God through you, because you may be the only Bible they ever pick up. You see, our lives communicate a story of who we believe God to be. And David's actions in this moment are going to communicate a story that's told in the future to many, many generations. And how he responds will influence countless people. David, what story do you want people to tell about you? Do you want them to tell about how you repaid evil with evil? Or do you want to be known as the king who returned evil with grace and the love of God? It's a different way of thinking, but friends, I believe it's the most Christ-like response we can have. And friends, this is where Abigail's intelligence truly shines through. She was ahead of her time, because in the ancient world, responding to evil with more evil was the norm. But her mindset of responding to evil with humility, servanthood, and grace stops David in his tracks. You see, friends, revenge leads to more revenge. But when we confront evil with grace, it stops us in its tracks, and the enemy doesn't know how to respond. You see, we continue to see Abigail's mindset play out in the future of the Gospels in the New Testament, when Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Or when Peter says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Or when Paul writes in Romans, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of the world. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Friends, we are not called to respond the way the world responds. We're called to share the good news of the gospel that there is a better way. For Abigail, for Jesus, for Peter, for Paul, and for all of us, the redemptive and loving response for those who have wronged us is not revenge, but grace. Because in the same way that revenge continues to build upon itself in destructive and toxic cycles, grace and kindness build upon each other in a much stronger, powerful, transforming way that does not lead to destruction, but rather the advancement of God's kingdom here on earth. Woodhaven Reformed Church, may we be a church that doesn't respond in the ways of the world, but may we show the heart of God and show that there is a better way. That when the world casts shame, we show empathy and restoration. When the world casts judgment, we show love and grace. When the world shows evil and hatred, we show peace and kindness. When the world shows injustice, we seek healing and reconciliation. When the world shows power and looking down upon others who may be different, we show humility, servanthood, and open arms. Friends, this is the Abigail way. This is the Christ-like way. This, I pray, is the Woodhaven way. And that doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. Responding in a different way than the rest of the world is hard. It takes courage, patience, intelligence. It takes listening to the voice of God over everything else. Abigail could have listened to so many other voices. She could have listened to culture who tried to silence her, the voice of fear or common sense, the voice of, I can't win this. But she listened to the voice of God. During challenging times, we're confronted with a variety of voices in our head. And how we respond is important. Often those voices will try to convince us to freeze. But despite what the voice in your head or the voice of the enemy might be saying, remember that God is for you, God is with you, and if God has called you to it, God will empower you to accomplish it. David was on the bad course. His anger had a hold of him. And if David would have proceeded with his plan to kill everyone, who knows what the rest of his story would have looked like. And now David has a choice to make. And so as we close, let's look at how David responds. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, good thing she didn't wait 2 years, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. There's a lot to learn from Abigail in this story, but there's also something valuable we can learn from David. He had the courage and the ears to listen when he was confronted. Confrontation in relationships is hard, but sometimes it's absolutely necessary. I think all of us can admit that we don't like being told when we're wrong, and normally our first response is to defend ourselves. But David doesn't argue. He simply listens to Abigail and admits that she could see things in his blind spot that he couldn't see. You see, I've learned that one of the most important lines in my marriage has been, you were right and I was wrong. Now, unfortunately, I have to use that way more often than I would like to admit, but my wife Chelsea is my Abigail. She sees things in a different way, and she loves me enough to call me out when I forget who I am. David had the ears to listen. He had the strength to admit he was wrong, and he chose the better way. And friends, we've all been in that situation before. We're about to make a bad decision out of anger or wanting to fit in. We've lost sight of who we are, but hurt feelings, someone wronging you, never justify sin. We're all broken people. There's not one of us in this room who won't make a mistake. And those decisions do have consequences. But we need to be reminded that our failures do not define us. That like David, we can admit when we're wrong. We can remember who we are, and we can get back on the path that God has outlined for our lives. There are many lessons in this story, but perhaps the biggest lesson is that we need to find people who will be Abigails in our lives that love us enough and are courageous enough to remind us of who we are and ask the question, what story, when all of this is just a memory, do you want people to tell? And in the same way, we need to be Abigails in the lives of others. That's the power and the calling of God's church, to be a committed community that supports one another and shows each other grace, love, and truth, because it's not I in Jesus, it's we in Jesus. So friends, who has been an Abigail in your life? Who's been someone that spoke important words that have made an impact? I've had countless people who have met me during difficult situations when I forgot who I was. Last story, when I was in 7th grade, I attended a basketball camp at Cornerstone University. And that week, I was bullied constantly about my height, and I started to forget who I was. However, one night towards the end of the week, one of the players on Cornerstone's team who was serving as a counselor that week saw that I was struggling, and he pulled me aside. He asked me what was wrong. And he told me not to care about what other people think or how they saw me, that yes, I was short, but there's nothing wrong with that. He said the world's going to say a lot of things about you that you can't control as you get older, but you can control how you let it affect you. He said you control your heart, your hard work, and your hustle. Live into who you are, and that will always be enough. He was someone that was behind the scenes, but he made a huge impact in my life. You see, growing up, I didn't remember who he was. But almost 17 years later, I had the opportunity to go on an Israel trip led by Brad Gray. And the night before we were leaving, on Facebook, Brad shared a picture of his college basketball team at Cornerstone University. And as I looked at this picture, I noticed that the same coach who had spoke to me 17 years earlier was who I was about to go to Israel with. God will place the people in our lives who speak the truths we need to hear when we need to hear it the most. But the question is, will we listen? Friends, you may think that you're just behind the scenes, that one small conversation that you had might not mean anything. But friends, I believe that when we are walking in the footsteps of Jesus, when we are faithfully telling the story of the scriptures with our lives, God will use what we think are small, simple, behind the scenes, everyday interactions and transform them to have kingdom building impact. I am who I am for a variety of reasons. I'll never forget that conversation I had. So friends, this week, how can we be inspired by the courage and wisdom and the faithfulness of Abigail to stand up for someone else? Think about how you can gently, compassionately remind someone of God's love and call for their life. Because friends, we can never underestimate the impact our words can have. God gave you a voice to make sure that God's story is experienced by others through you. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the stories of the scriptures. We thank you for the people that you place in our lives who remind us of your love and who we are. God, may we share the story of you with how we live our lives. And may we strive to be Abigails in the lives of others. Amen.